Tonight, we begin with a paradox. We begin with the Vikings, a people who treated mortality not as a tragic inevitability, but as a professional milestone. To the modern mind, death is something to be delayed, negotiated with, or ignored until the last possible second. To a Viking, dying in battle was a career achievement. It was the ultimate promotion. But before you get comfortable, take a moment to really visualize that mindset. Imagine a culture where the worst possible outcome of your day wasn't pain or loss or violence. It was safety. Dying peacefully in bed, surrounded by weeping relatives and warm blankets, was the Viking equivalent of a career-ending embarrassment. It was a failure of marketing. You didn't want your gravestone to read, "He lived bravely, paid his taxes, and then caught a chill." You wanted it to scream of axes, blood, and the kind of glorious ruin that made the gods spill their mead. This cultural confidence ran on a beautifully simple operating system. If something scares you, attack it. If it's bigger than you, attack it harder. If you die, excellent. You have unlocked Valhalla, which is essentially a VIP lounge for people who enjoy fighting and fermented honey. This worldview stripped life of its usual anxieties. Vikings were not supposed to feel fear, at least not in public, not in writing, and definitely not in front of anyone holding a weapon. From childhood, they were raised on a steady diet of impossible expectations. They were fed stories where heroes sailed into storms that looked actively hostile, fought enemies twice their size, and died smiling. According to Viking standards, smiling while dying was simply good customer service to the gods. Fear was something monks experienced while watching their monastery burn. Vikings experienced only mild concern, followed immediately by violence. This absolute certainty shows up everywhere in the historical sources. The sagas are filled with men who mock kings to their faces, insult entire armies, and treat fortified cities like mildly inconvenient speed bumps. Even when they lost, they rarely admitted it honestly. Defeat was blamed on bad luck, trickery, sorcery, or someone else not following the plan properly. Fear never made the list of excuses. Fear was a waste of time. You could not dodge destiny. The Norns had already spun your thread, so you might as well meet your fate swinging an axe. It was a loud, brash, adrenaline-fueled way to view the universe. Which is why it gets so incredibly interesting when the volume suddenly drops. Because in a few rare places in the North Corpus, the boasting stops. The language changes. It shifts from the clear, crisp narration of battles and plunder to something vague, hesitant, and uncomfortable. Locations are mentioned briefly and then avoided, like someone accidentally bringing up an awkward family secret at a dinner party. There are no dramatic speeches recorded in these regions. No heroic last stands are celebrated. There is just silence. And in a Viking story, silence is screaming. These were people who raided across continents, from the coasts of North America to the rivers of Russia. They fought armored knights, Frankish cavalry, and English housecarls with confidence. Yet there was one group whose lands the Vikings rarely raided, whose warriors they did not eagerly challenge, and whose reputation spread without the usual Viking exaggeration. No boasts, no tall tales, just a careful, deliberate distance. The fear here was not loud. It did not shout or sing or clash shields. It quietly adjusted the rudder of the ship to go in a different direction. Because when a culture that treats death like a networking opportunity starts hesitating, something has gone terribly, embarrassingly wrong. And whatever frightened the Vikings did not do so with swords or superior numbers. It did it by making them deeply, existentially uncomfortable. If the Vikings were afraid of fighting, they would have stayed home in Scandinavia farming turnips. They did not stay home. They built the most advanced ships of their age and sailed directly toward people who very clearly did not want visitors. Fighting was not the problem. Fighting was the plan. Vikings were comfortable with violence because violence made sense. You could see an enemy, you could count them, you could estimate whether this fight was worth the trouble or merely going to ruin your afternoon. Even when things went badly, the rules were familiar. Someone swung, someone blocked, someone probably died loudly. Physics applied. But what the Vikings found in the deep north, in the lands of the Sami, was a violation of these rules. They encountered a fear that had nothing to do with losing a fair fight. They were not afraid of warriors. They were afraid of situations where their usual advantages, strength, mass, intimidation, simply evaporated. They were afraid of a world that refused to cooperate. Vikings expected battles to be sensory experiences, shields clashing, men shouting, drums beating, the smell of sweat and iron. If nothing was happening, that was unsettling. Silence was not normal. Silence meant something was watching, and in the lands of the Sami, the silence was heavy, oppressive, and absolute. Imagine landing in unfamiliar territory, marching inland and feeling the weight of eyes on you without ever seeing a soul. No scouts on the ridges, no obvious enemies forming shield walls, no villages to burn, just forest, snow, and tracks that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Arrows would arrive without introduction, striking a man down before the sound of the bowstring even reached the group, and departing before anyone could complain about them. That kind of conflict was deeply irritating to a Viking. They preferred enemies who stood still long enough to be hit. They respected strength, but they understood it. This was rude. This was cheating. This felt less like warfare and more like being slowly bullied by geography itself. Viking weapons were heavy, their armor was heavy, their shields were heavy. All of this equipment worked beautifully on open ground or the deck of a ship, but when movement slowed, when visibility disappeared into the gray haze of a northern winter, and when sound behaved strangely in the dense pine forests, all that equipment became less impressive and more exhausting. Suddenly, the fearless warrior was sweating, disoriented, and deeply suspicious of every tree. This fear was not cowardice, it was frustration mixed with a dawning realization that brute force was no longer solving the problem, and Vikings hated problems that could not be punched into submission. They did not fear dying in battle, they feared wasting effort on battles that refused to happen. So when Vikings began to avoid certain lands, it was not because they were weak, it was because those lands refused to fight them properly, and that was unacceptable. This sets the stage for a conflict that wasn't really a conflict at all, but a psychological siege. The Sami did not need to defeat the Vikings, they just needed to make the Vikings wish they were somewhere else. And to understand how they did that, we have to look at the map, or rather the places where the map stopped working.